Okay then, so if we start, Tim, by explaining who we are in the sense of why we feel we've got the right to opine, opinionate on this particular topic of mental health, or what's called mental health, and the lockdowns and the limits to growth, and then go on to discuss what might be wrong with all that and how institutions and policymakers and organizations are approaching this and what we think they might be doing. In that, perhaps if there's a little bit of time, I don't know, a thumbnail sketch of the history of mental health in the institutional sense, maybe. And then conclude with what might be happening in the future, and what would be useful to do. Okay, so do you want to start?
Okay, so
why you've got the right to talk about this?
But we are both what I think they nowadays call service users, although I haven't actually used a service in 20 years. But back in the 1990s, I had quite a severe episode of depression, which was the result, firstly, of my marriage breaking down, then of losing my job as a consequence of going through all of the shite with the marriage, and then having lost my job, I lost my income, which put everything else at risk. So very much that downward spiral. I mean, at the time, very few people were open about talking about mental health problems. So I took the step into campaigning to think my experience can't be unique. So I started looking around for other people that were experiencing similar things and started kind of building networks of people to say, let's actually look at what needs to be done. Because employment came out as a big issue, that far too many employers faced with somebody that was getting depressed, just wanted to fire them because you couldn't be productive when you were in that state. So I mean, we did a lot of where we got to. I ended up running a mental health charity for a decade, where we won awards in the end for the various self-management programs that we developed, which very much put medicine and the medical approaches to mental illness into a much smaller box than it wanted to be. So if you like, at the time, a lot of psychiatry people and a lot of GPs were talking about how self-help has a really big role to play in managing mental illness. My response was, no, you're trying to put a big self-help box into a little tiny medical box. The reality is that medicine has a role to play within the broad sweep of self-help. And that actually very often for people, recovery is about things far outside what medicine talks about. And I suppose at the time we got a few psychiatrists and psychologists to buy in, but generally not many. And of course, that was an era where all of the narrative was coming out of the drug companies with the SSRI drugs, trying to make this claim that depression was all about sort of chemical imbalances in your brain. So that was very much, their view was very much, this is a problem internal to the individual and it has to be chemically fixed. Whereas where we were coming from was, no, this is a problem about life. That people have problems before they have diagnoses.
Okay, so thanks for that. My situation was that I was a campus revolutionary in the late 60s when there were lots of sit-ins, and a campus celebrity and an economist. And when I left university, I wasn't really fit for anything, and I fell flat on my face psychologically. And I started having what were called psychiatric crises at the end of the 1970s. And I bought into the idea that I had what was then called manic depression. I think it's probably now called bipolar. So for the end of the 1970s, all the way through the 1980s, I was having some quite serious mental health crises, partly depression, partly going absolutely wild and crazy and being put in psychiatric hospital. In the middle of all this, in the middle of the 1980s, I I fell in with a group of people who were involved with Nottingham Mind, the mental health charity. And at that time, there was a user movement in psychiatry was just getting off the ground in Nottingham. And I got involved with that. And through that, when the development worker who helped start all that left in 1986, I think it was, I got a job as a development worker of Nottingham Mind, Nottingham Mental Health Association. So there I was, a psychiatric patient, but I was also working in the mental health service in this charity. And the first thing I was able to do for a number of years was work on my own mental health problems as part of my job, which was quite a useful thing. And as time went on, I became more and more skeptical of the medical model of psychiatry in some of the ways that you were describing there, essentially. And I developed my own theory of what my mental health problems were all about, and generally what mental health problems are all about, not just mine, but other people's, which is, as I say, a bit like what you're saying. It's for me at the time, it seemed, and it still seems, that it was a way of describing the emotional and psychological turmoil of going through a life transition, which has gone wrong. And the life transition which had gone wrong for me was the transition from the family home, school, through university into adult life. And this had gone wrong partly because of the politics, but partly because my family upbringing hadn't equipped me for many of the important changes in life. And I really wasn't clear what I was doing or what I was trying to do and so on. And because it had gone wrong, my emotional life and my self-understanding was very, 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 very low. I really didn't understand the way my emotions worked and what I was trying to do and so on. Anyway, so it was a botched life transition is how I describe it. When you change in your habitat, where you live, your relationships, who you're living with, from parents to hopefully having a partner and having a sexual life and so on, and to a job which would be very difficult if you were a revolutionary and very skilled at making sit-ins. It's not an ideal the sort of thing which would attract employers. So the result of this, I ended up with a job developing, as I say, developing my own ideas and becoming. In the mid 1990s, I was giving lectures on what psychotic breakdowns are like and where they come from. And like you, I came to the conclusion that actually the issue was really, there were two ways of seeing it. One way of seeing it was that things had gone wrong in your life, and that was then giving rise to these emotional confusions and distress and so on. And the other way of seeing was that something has gone wrong in your mind, and because of this thing going wrong in your mind, you have chaos in your lifestyle. It's sort of like the other way around. So anyway, that's our background. So shall we why we think we've got the qualifications to opinionate on these sort of issues. Shall we go on to the current crisis of the lockdown and why we think at this time there's an incredibly large amount of distress and confusion and so on, which are being called mental health problems. I'll hand that over to you then.
Yeah, I mean, we're starting to see headlines in the media about how we are facing a mental health crisis. And yet, from what I'm seeing of the research that I've seen, and admittedly, the research is going to be backward looking, because a lot of it will have been research that was done in the first lockdown. But actually, I think a lot of people went into that thinking that because people were going to be socially isolated and were going to struggle financially, that they were going to start seeing lots of mental illness. But what I've seen of the results that have come out thus far is that they haven't. And in a way, it doesn't surprise me. One of my experiences working with people with depression is depression very rarely materializes during a crisis. You do occasionally get people where things just get so out of control that they break down. More often it's when the crisis is over. So if you like, somebody that's going through a divorce doesn't get depressed in the middle of that process. They get depressed after the divorce, or after they've lost their job, or it's that spiraling out of control of life. The problem with the sort of lockdown thing, in a way, is it's a bit artificial. So a lot of people are at home, but they're getting paid for being at home. So a lot of people are furloughed. So that a lot of the things that ordinarily in life would spiral you downwards aren't actually happening yet. So that in a sense, the bigger crisis may come some months from now, when all of the various support packages are withdrawn. So you have, in a sense, it's bizarre because you have people put into a situation that ordinarily would result in mental health problems, but I mean, almost because everybody's in that position and it's got an artificiality about it, we're not seeing it manifest that widely yet.
Yeah, there is an issue. I mean, I remember very early on in my sort of experience and discussions about all this sort of thing, there's a kind of idea that mental health problems are things that happen to individuals. When something is happening to whole communities, it's a bit different. When it happens to an individual, very often people can't understand why somebody is upset, why somebody is confused. So because they haven't got a way of attributing the confusion and upsetness to particular things, they assume that it's something gone wrong in their brain, not something gone wrong in their life. But if you have a situation where millions of people are going through the same situation, and maybe millions of people are unhappy about that, but it's kind of understandable to everybody else, you don't describe it as a mental health problem. That's quite, I mean, I think that's quite an important thing. And if people don't need their own individual explanation for what's gone wrong with them. And I think that when people are very, very upset, they often find it very, very difficult to explain why they're upset. That's why it becomes understood as something's wrong with them. But in this circumstances, it doesn't apply quite the same way. But nevertheless, people are still upset, and it seems to me that one of the issues has been that when I was working in the mental health service and doing a lot of work on this, I thought it was really fundamental to a lot of mental health issues when people are in a situation of enforced isolation. And they are now. Both you and I are in this situation, enforced isolation. And then a lot of the things which happen in enforced isolation are then described as mental health problems. In enforced isolation, you are in a situation of, or you can easily become in a situation of sensory deprivation. Like in a sensory deprivation experiment, you don't go out, you don't see people, you don't have the stimulus of anything, and every day is like every other day, and so on. So you get into a structureless time of daydreaming and wishful thinking and hoping it's going to end and all this sort of thing. Now, if that happens to an individual on their own, that's seen as mental health problem. That is, I mean, so it's a bit of a strange situation like that.
Yeah, of course, we have the sort of vested interest playing out now with various people in the charity sector starting to talk up a crisis. Of course, part of that is going to be just because they want their sort of hands on some of the government funding that's being slopped around at the moment. Okay, probably reasonably so. I mean, if everybody else is getting some government dosh. But one of the things that charities do is to talk up the needs of their particular client group in a crisis in order to get some funding in. So some of the media headlines are being driven by charities who I think are over-exaggerating the crisis as is now. I mean, they may be correct to say that when all of this is over and they try to unlock, that we may see quite a big increase in mental health problems thereafter. And almost the longer it goes, so if you like, if when they withdraw the furlough scheme and you're unfortunate enough to be one of the 1.5 million or so people they're expecting to be laid off, then you have, as you say, that sort of explanation that I am one of this big group of people who's lost their jobs through no fault of their own. I think as time goes on and a large part of that group sort of churns back into work, I mean, through whatever, I mean, whether they end up better off or not, those that are left and are still unemployed after sort of months and months, it's at that point that you lose that ability to sort of say, well, I'm the same as everyone else. So I think that plus whether the social isolation we're in now results in a breakdown of networking, they have to wait and see. But going to the pub might be a difficult thing to do initially after this, because there might not be any pubs because they're all going bust. Same with cafes and stuff. So all of the places that we'd be used to going and socializing, actually they may not be there when we open.
But can we come back to this business about you say mental health problems? It's both you and I, having worked in and been involved in the field, the words come into the mind too easily. And part of what I want to say is that what we're talking about really mental health problems? Is this an appropriate way of even thinking about them? There is a group of psychologists who are mental health service users, as they're called, as we used to be called, who say if we're going to make any progress, we need to stop thinking about what we're talking about here as health problems, as if we were ill, because the way they wanted to talk about that is to say, can we change the language piece? Because what doctors do, and what they will no doubt do still, is to change the language for what are just ordinary problems, or nearly ordinary problems that happen to everybody. So, for example, somebody is described as having, an attention deficit disorder. An attention deficit disorder is you can't concentrate on what a doctor is saying to you because you've got more important things on your mind. You're worried about paying the bills, you're worried about paying the rents and so on, and you're distracted because of this. And it's a much more ordinary way of thinking about it. But once you think about it as an attention deficit disorder, it's within the sphere of a doctor's competence, and there's probably a drug for it. And that is actually quite a dangerous situation if doctors keep still using these terminologies and this way of thinking about it. There's a kind of reversion to this idea that there's a health problem going on. I mean, if you're depressed because you haven't seen anybody for day after day after day after day, is depressed the right word? We use the word depression as a health problem, but actually you're demoralized and you're lonely because you've not seen anybody. And the way which it's in the language and the way of thinking, a human problem arising out of issues in your life getting turned into problems inside you for which there's a diagnosis and a pill is actually quite dangerous, because it means that it's the way in which disaster capitalism makes its money. The fact that there's a crisis and there's mass misery means there's a mass market for opioids, for antidepressants, and no doubt this will continue. And this is actually a serious problem. It's a way of thinking that facilitates disaster capitalism.
Yeah, I think this time round there's likely to be less input from the drug companies. Because fortunately they don't have any new psychiatric drugs to push at the moment. Whereas last time around, coming out of the depression of the 1980s, the Prozac was developed in 86. So it sort of corresponded with the end of the sort of Thatcher depression. And it was easy for them to sell you the idea that, oh, it's a brain chemistry thing and take some of these and you'll be fine. The other dimension to it is this sort of victim problem. So that you were set up in such a way that if you needed to claim benefits, basically you had to play along with the sort of I'm ill, therefore I can get a sick note in order to have permission not to have to be forced into work. So that in a sense, that victim perspective, I mean, it's there in some of the charities, and it depends which one you look at, but there are charities. I always make the distinction in the charity field between charities for and charities of. There are lots of charities that are for people that have particular problems. There are far fewer, or they tend to be less well publicized, charities made up of people that actually have the problem that is being dealt with. And very often when the two are together, you get a totally different view. But the charities for very often have a vested interest in creating a dependency in the client group that they're aimed at. So in a sense, they want you to be a victim. Therefore, they want this to be your problem. And the solution, or part of the solution, is you come to our charity and we look after you. So that is part of that disaster capitalism game as well. Whereas they say in the charities that are of people that have problems, like the old saying used to be that there's no such thing as disability, just disabling environments. As I said, the problem isn't intrinsic to me, it's the world around me.
Yeah, and I think this disaster capitalism thing, you can get an impression from the sort of Naomi Klein's shock doctrine, disaster capitalism, as if it's sort of new, but actually it's been going on for centuries. Just to talk about a little bit about the history of psychiatry, and over a few centuries, the ruling elite nicked the commons from the ordinary people of this country, and they enslaved people all around the world. And then, surprise, surprise, people who had the commons stolen from them, where they got their firewood and been able to put graze their animals and so on, and live from, ended up destitute. And if they ended up destitute, which is what we're talking about, this danger now with the lockdown, they also ended up extremely distressed and sometimes angry and sometimes recidivists, and kicking against the elite who'd done this to them. And so they became regarded as problem people because of what the elite had done. And their emotions became regarded as problems. So what happened? Some entrepreneurs had this bright idea of rounding people up and putting them in workhouses and treating them like dirt, making them wear uniforms, not allowing them to talk to each other, crushing their morale and spirit, and so on. And the workhouses and the asylums were essentially very much like each other and essentially the same thing. Meanwhile, the slaves in say in America, if they ran away, they were seen as being guilty. Well, not guilty, they were seen as being ill. They were seen as having a psychiatric problem called what's it called, drapetomania, which is a mental illness of slaves when they run away. And the cure for it is to whip them, whip the devil out of them. And that's the cure for this particular mental illness of slavery. So you get this, well, I would call that insanity, actually. I would call that insanity, but it's imposed on ordinary people for so that ordinary people's spirit and their own desire for freedom and is crushed. And I think that is in current circumstances, if things continue to get worse, and I think things probably will continue to get worse, that kind of elite response of turning things upside down is actually a real danger here. And I think the real danger is that psychiatric ways of thinking and psychiatric treatments will re-emerge. And it's already happened in places like the United States over the last few years, where there's an absolute mass of new prescriptions for opioids. So you've got huge areas of the United States where people are addicted to opioids and are rendered, and that of course makes huge amounts of money for the drug manufacturers, and it wrecks people's lives and makes them completely dependent and so on. So I think this problem isn't going to go away.
Yeah, I suppose it's worth pointing out that psychiatry itself as a profession, its history is in jails and penal servitude, not in health. It's actually only very recently, actually antidepressant drugs and antipsychotic drugs, the very terminology was an attempt to copy antibiotics, because the profession desperately needed something that had a health feel about it. Because certainly right up until the beginning of the 20th century, the main role of the psychiatrist was to jail people. That, as you say, these are problem people. They interfere with the society. We don't want them, sort of upsetting people. Let's lock them away somewhere. And what the psychiatrist then did to them, I mean, whether, I guess a lot of them did it out of a misplaced kindness, but the administration of beatings and electric shocks and the ice cold baths and all the other things that used to pass as psychiatric treatments back in the day. Because the modern equivalent would be the sort of benefit system sanctions regime, where if you haven't found a job, then we'll take away half of your money and see whether that stimulates you to go and get a job. And if that doesn't work, we'll take away all of your money. And we'll see whether starving you to death might motivate you. I also the almost joke saying that the beatings will continue until morale improves. But that is the system that we had before the pandemic. I think the problem now is they may well sort of roll that out on a much wider basis. The government is already bringing in the usual corporate welfare recipients to roll out their sort of back to work programs. And those, all of them are designed to root the problem in the individual. That the fact that we've just destroyed millions of jobs and crushed people's livelihoods, that has nothing to do with it. This is all the fault of this person who isn't motivated to go and find a job.
Yeah.
So, we've got to pay this company billions of pounds to find fault in the individual and to address those faults in order to get them into work. And the fact that we're not going to be creating any bloody jobs anyway. So that program just repeats and repeats and demoralizes people still further. And probably will increase the suicide rate considerably. But they will get rich out of it. Government will tick the various boxes that allow it to claim it's doing something. And once again, the people at the very bottom of the heap will be the ones that suffer the worst, and the media will ignore it.
Well, absolutely. And that's what I think exactly what's happened over centuries, that you blame the victims. You blame the victims of your own policies and processes which are too big for the ruling elite to control. I mean, I wouldn't say that the limits to economic growth, that the crisis of the energy system, for example, which is happening at the moment, can be entirely blamed to the vindictive venality of the elite. There's a historical process going on as well, but they fail to understand it and they fail to respond to it, and they're certainly not responding to it in a socially equitable way, which really distributes the costs, distributes the pain of adjustment to everybody equally. So there's a real social solidarity, which is what needs to happen. But in the absence of that, what happens is that the elite push away all responsibility and blame the victims. And that makes it even worse for the victims. And not only blame the victims, but actually try and the last place where you can make money is in building the prisons, building the new workhouses, or producing the new opioids and tranquilizers and so on. And that's the danger of this situation for me. And unless people realize what's going on, it's going to make it much worse for people's mental health problems. If that's the right word for it. That's, as I say, because I find myself automatically thinking back into this way of thinking. What we're talking about is people's distress and confusion about what's happening. And this,
I think we worked with a guy called Paul Keedwell, who was doing research at Cardiff University in the late 90s. He reckoned his big thing was like, if depression is such a problem, how come it persists across history and across every society that you come across? And how come when you look at other mammals, you find pretty much the same behavior? His argument was that it has evolved as an adaptive response to the sort of external situations that are beyond the individual. And he points to the physicality of it, that, that sort of hunched down, sort of not looking up, tense shoulders, all of that stuff that people would recognize as being the physical dimension of that, as being common across so many species. That, basically, if you take rats and deprive them of sort of contact with other creatures, or sort of put monkeys in isolation, that they too will develop that physicality of depression. That it is, if you like, it's a coping mechanism. The problem is that the economy that we've now built doesn't give you the space to actually deal with it. So in a sense, just at that point that you're hunching down under the pressure of it all, they pile more pressure on. And tell you to snap out of it and give you drugs that are meant to snap you out of it, but they more often just going to give you more side effects and withdrawal symptoms when you try to kick them.
When I was working in the mental health field, I spent a lot of time thinking about what emotions are and what their functions are, and I came to the conclusion that the function of depression, its useful function, is to make you give up, because some situations, essentially, you're getting depressed because you're trying to do something which is futile, because it's much more powerful. There's a process going on which is much more powerful than you, and which is crushing you. So in those circumstances, the best thing to do is give up. And in depression, you lose the energy, you lose the ability to try and think a way through it, and you simply give up, which may be the thing that's actually necessary. But in our current society, the trouble with being depressed is that you then become no use to anybody, which in our society you're supposed to be. If you can't, you need to look after, you need to be a source of money. Okay, well, we just had a break in continuity on the Zoom when I was talking about depression, the basic idea, and we just restarted. I mean, the basic idea that I was talking about at that time when the break happened was that depression is a way of you not pursuing something that's futile, because and your body and your mind won't let you, because you're not getting anywhere. So the energy to do so disappears, which has a certain analogy to an economic depression. And it's also interesting that the psychologist Kubler-Ross, who made a living helping people through the dying process, had this model of in which depression is actually a step forward, because what happens when you're depressed is you're realizing what a horrible situation you're in, and you're coming to grips with reality. You're no longer pursuing futility. I think there is this idea among therapists that depression is often a good sign because you're coming to grips with reality. So
I suppose at least as long as you're aware that that's the case. I mean, the bad bit is if somebody's sort of suffering in silence, and because we are pre-programmed with all of these ideas about how life ought to be, which again has a parallel with the wider economy. I think one of the points I've made time and again is that all of the economics textbooks are based on the post-war boom.
Mm.
So the idea is that 20-year period that is a historical anomaly, that's normal and everything else is an attempt to get back to. That is as delusional a sort of mental illness as you can get. The sort of belief that 20-year period is in any way normal. That is like somebody who wins the lottery and starts to believe that that's something to do with them. It wasn't just luck. It wasn't to do with external factors. It was me, which of course a lot of wealthy people have that. There's this idea that I am successful because of my efforts, and not because I was born into the right family or went to the right school or met the right people. I think at the bottom of the heap that we are less inclined to kind of blame. Sort of self-blame is a fruitless strategy. But I wonder, thinking about it for the economy as a whole, that actually it needs the same thing. It is in a position where it needs to let go. That we cannot have infinite growth on an infinite planet. It is now causing us more harm than any good it was doing. And continuing to pursue it is only going to end in tears. So that in a way, the people who are now losing their jobs might be the people of the future. If we start to reorientate into a different kind of economy. I think that, as I said, the difficulty I think is that after the pandemic, whenever a grown-up comes along and declares that it's over, once that's come to an end, I fear that there's going to be this attempt to recreate the economy of December 2019. I think we've already seen the new Biden administration in the States has talked about printing, $1.9 trillion to pump into stimulus to try to get everything going again. And of course, there just isn't the energy or the raw resources to turn that currency into real production. So what it's more likely to do is carry on inflating the things that it's so far inflated. So it'll be stagnation at the bottom and inflation at the top. And again, for people coming out of lockdown, if we are still expected to have that mentality of, we're going to go back to some kind of normal, then the inability to do so can lead people into all kinds of life crises.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And going back to normal for a lot of people will mean looking for a job. And the government has got this choice, and policymakers have got this choice. One is to say, all right, we're going to have these projects to help you find work when there is no work to be found. Or it's got the other choice of saying, right, okay, because there is no work, we're going to create the work. We're going to create, for example, tree planting projects. We're going to create work by making land available for people to cultivate. We're going to enable people to go to, centers where they can find tools and equipment and so on, and learn practical manual skills, or we're going to help people renovate their own homes and save energy in their own homes and learn skills at the same time. And we're going to, as a government, make sure that everybody has work, because we're going to create the work. We're not going to pretend to help you learn how to write a job application and all that kind of crap. Because one kind of scheme will actually, and I've seen it happen in the project activity that I was involved in Nottingham. If people find a place to go where they have things to do, where they're not looked down on because of their so-called psychiatric problems, then they recover. If they're sent off and persecuted for not having jobs when nobody's actually creating jobs, then they don't recover. They just end up as demoralized. And I think these are the kind of issues that we've got to address. And I used to call this, still call it, recycling lives. A new start. A new start is a new occupation, a source of income. Well, not a source of income, a sort of something to do, like growing vegetables in an allotment plot or something like that, where people can meet other people on equal terms, like community gardens, this kind of thing. I think this is really a really important aspect of the sorts of things which would actually be useful and the sorts of things which will be incredibly destructive.
Yeah, the problem is, in a sense, central governments are going in the opposite direction, where they're buying into all of this, what they call great reset stuff, of the, we are going to magically figure out how to do nuclear fusion, and that's going to power us so we can all be driven around in self-driving electric cars. Kind of all of our stuff will be dropped into our houses by drones, and we're all going to work digitally on our laptops. I mean, it's a nice fantasy, but it's completely, if you want to talk about insanity, I mean, that one is about as insane as it gets. There is no material basis by which you can build that economy, but governments are buying into it. So we're almost on this road to self-destruction that is going to be accelerated by chasing the wrong vision of a workable future. I dare say, okay, there'll be a bit of money to be made in insulating a few homes and putting up a few wind turbines. But it detracts from the kind of stuff you're talking about in terms of recycling tools, learning how to fix things instead of throwing things away, which has been up until now what we've done. And apparently shipping costs now are such that there is simply no prospect of us going back to sending all of our rubbish to Asia to be dealt with. So we're going to have to deal with it here one way or another. And the other side of that equation is the cost of things that we import. At the moment, it's manifesting just as shortages. So if you go on Amazon and try to order things, if it's anything that's imported, it will probably come back and tell you that it's out of stock. That's actually happening quite a lot. It's basically because the supply chains from Asia have broken down. The cost of a container has gone from, I think it was about £1,200 at the beginning of the first lockdown. It's now up to 12,000. So companies actually cannot afford to import what they were selling anymore. As long as we remain locked down, that's not that much of a problem because you don't have to buy any of that stuff while you're sat in your own house. But the moment they try to open up, that's going to be a problem. So in a sense, recycling the stuff we've already got might start to become a viable option. And sort of buying more used goods and more recycled goods becomes more viable. But I doubt that government is looking at that kind of, if you like, it's just not techno-utopian enough. Government is imagining some kind of white heat of technology, new industrial revolution. So until government breaks out of that idea that we can continue to have infinite growth, basically just swap energy sources, we are stuck with that. I think people will be casualties along the way. Whether or not local councils can be persuaded to invest in the kind of stuff you're talking about, a different matter.
Well, I'm pessimistic about that because I've watched what's happening in Nottingham now, and essentially what's happening in Nottingham now is that the council is in really severe financial difficulties, and as a result of its severe financial difficulties, which kind of parallels the kind of things we've been talking about with individuals, it also occurs between bits of government, that the central government is kind of judging Nottingham for its terrible financial situation and sending in aged accountants with knighthoods to balance the books. And then that's another source of mental health problems. It's not just lockdowns. I mean, the Nottingham City Council is telling its staff there's got to be a culture change in order to balance the books. And this culture change is written in their policy documents in such intangible terms. You wonder what the hell it can possibly mean. But ultimately, there's only one thing it can mean. It's essentially, you've got to work harder with less money. And you've got to do this in the pursuit of excellence, and in a city which is world class at everything it does, including culture change to balance the books. And it reminds me of the cart horse boxer in Animal Farm, whose solution for all problems is to say, I must work harder, and I support Napoleon, who is, of course, the boss in Animal Farm. And I support Councillor Mellon, the new leader of Nottingham City Council, and I must work harder. And this culture change. Of course, it's rubbish. You can't. The problems and the issues are far too big for sending in the accountants and balancing the books. So I don't see local authorities as having at the moment the conceptual mental ability. I mean, it's not just that if anybody is going crazy in the old-fashioned insanity sense, it's the policymakers who are just so out of touch with reality. It's mind-boggling. They just cannot. There was a famous quote from John Maynard Keynes: the problem is not new ideas, it's escaping from old ones. And the people who are utterly unable to escape from old ones are the politicians, not just the Tory party, but the Labour Party as well. Nottingham is a Labour council, the Tory party, the Labour Party at a national level as well.
Yeah, same here. I mean, we've got a Labour council who thinks that it's going to solve its problems financially by putting council tax up 4%.
Yeah.
Now, why I say it only thinks that is because what's coming, basically it's going to face a massive drop in business rates. It's at the same time going to face a hell of a lot of people who can no longer afford to pay rents, who are going to be claiming housing benefit. And it's going to face a lot of people who can't anymore afford to pay the council tax. So in a sense, it's almost like a catch-22, that the more it tries to raise the tax, the more it will drive its income down, because it will drive people into destitution. I think councils across the UK are in a similar position. That, I think half of them are technically bankrupt, and it's only because the Chancellor changed the rules that they're not officially bankrupt, but everyone knows if we withdraw the support, they'll come crashing down tomorrow morning. So again, part of the relocalization process has to be looking at what do we want local government to do and how do we want it to do it? Because up until now, as with all arms of the state, it's sort of gathered unto itself all sorts of different legal functions. And that's always suited the people within it who get to have higher salaries the more functions they preside over. So there was a time where the head of the local council used to earn a fairly modest salary, whereas now they compare themselves to the likes of Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. And, it's like, because you can make squillions of dollars in the private sector, we too must be. And the problem is we're fast approaching a time where that kind of salary just can't be justified. I don't think it ever could. I mean, I always had the feeling back in the day when I worked in campaigning, I always used to recommend to the politicians that any time a civil servant or a council leader tells you that they could get more in the private sector than they're getting now, you should take that as a declaration that they've just handed in their notice and get rid of them.
Yeah.
If you think you can get more in the private sector, off you go, carry on. Because I'm sure half of them wouldn't last 5 minutes in the private sector. But yes, I think they are in a rather like national government, and this idea that we're going to increase taxes and sort of put a squeeze on what we spend in order to balance the books. I think that just isn't going to work.
But they're going to try though. I mean, it's like the famous Einstein quote about definition of insanity is to keep on trying to do something which has already failed. That's exactly what they're going to try and do, and that's exactly what sending in the accountants is all about. That's exactly what balancing the books is all about. Anyway, Tim, we could go on like this because the world is going mad, and of course it is, because people haven't readjusted to the changing times. So